Hey Algebra 2, today we're going to work through how do you solve word problems that involve quadratics. On the first couple, I want you to solve by factoring. As always, you have to make sure the equation is set equal to 0. So it says the height of a javelin in feet. So a javelin is like one of the sticks that they throw in track and field. Is modeled by this equation, where the t is time in seconds after it's thrown. How long is it in the air? So, how long is it in the air is the same as asking, when did it land? It might say that. So when it lands, it hits the ground. And the height of the ground equals 0. So I'm just copying down the equation at the moment. So if we want to know when it landed, that means we're going to have to set our equation equal to 0. We want to know when it landed. When you solve a quadratic, you have many options. You can factor it. You can run the quadratic formula. We currently don't really have the skill set to try to complete the square on this one, so we have two options. Today I'm going to force your hand and I'm going to make you solve it by factoring. So when we factor, we need to make an ACB chart. However, when I look at these, yes, there is no GCF, so I'm going to make an ACB chart. There's my A term, there's my B term, and there's my C term. So when I take negative 16 times 5, I get negative 80, and my B term is 79. So this actually doesn't factor too badly. So I know that 80 times 1 equals 80. One of them needs to be negative, so the 1 would need to be negative to add up to 79. So there's my winning combination. So this factors as t plus 80 and t minus 1. My A term is negative 16, so that means that you have to divide both of those number parts by negative 16. 80 divided by negative 16 equals negative 5. Negative divided by negative goes positive. 1 divided by 16 gets me a fraction, so the 16 has to slide on up. So this factors as 16t plus 1. So that is how this factors. However, we have to solve it. So that means we're going to break it apart and we're going to set each factor equal to 0. So we're going to add the 5 to both sides. So t equals 5. And here we're going to subtract the 1. 16t equals negative 1. We're going to divide, and t equals negative 1/16. So we wanted to know how long was it in the air. So this says, hey, it was in the air for 5 seconds. So that seems like our good, reasonable answer. This says it was in the air for negative 1/16 of a second. Since that is a negative time, we're going to cross that off and say, no, this is actually not reasonable. The next type of quadratic could involve dimensions of a shape. So let's do the rectangle. Find x and the dimensions. So let's label this and we'll say that this side is your length and this side is your width. And it's telling us that this is the area. So I'm going to use the area formula of length times width. And now I'm going to go substituting. It says A is 432. It says your length is x plus 4. And it says your width is x minus 2. When I have a quadratic, I can't have all this over here, so I'm going to have to multiply and distribute. X times x is x squared. X times negative 2 is negative 2x. Now move to the 4 and distribute. 4 times x is 4x. 4 times negative 2 is negative 8. I also have another guideline where my equation has to be set equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract 432 from both sides. Over here on this side, I'm going to combine like terms with my x's, and I'm going to combine like terms with my numbers. I'm going to write it in standard form and have x squared plus 2x minus 440. So I have to make an ACB chart for this, and I have to play around with the numbers if I have to factor it. I need factors that multiply and equal negative 440 that add up to 2. So anytime I see that it ends in a 0, I always know that it's divisible by 10. So I know that 10 times 44 is 440. It has to add up to a positive number, therefore the negative has to go on the smaller number. So that adds up to 34. That's not right. I noticed that 44 is also an even number, so I'm guessing that 440 is also divisible by 20. And when I did that in my calculator earlier, that was 22. So it has to add up to 2, so therefore the smaller number has to be the negative. That adds up to 2. So that one is your winning combination right there. So when I factor this factors as x minus 20, x plus 22 equals 0. A is 1, so I don't have to divide like I did in the last problem. I have to solve, so I'm just ready to break each part equal to 0. So when I do algebra and solve for x equals 20, and x equals negative 22. So it says find x and find the dimensions. So the width is x minus 2. So if x is 20, 20 minus 2 equals 18. That would be the width. If x equals negative 22, negative 22 minus 2 is negative 24, and you can't have a negative length, so therefore this answer is not reasonable. It's not that it wasn't reasonable immediately, it was that it wasn't reasonable when I plugged it in. So you have to make sure you plug it in and check out the numbers. The length is x plus 4, so when I plug 20 in for x, I get 24 for the length. On the back side, I have 2 more word problems. This time it says I can either use the quadratic formula or I can factor it. A package is released at 1,600 feet. It can be modeled by this equation. This 1,600 and this 1,600 is the same piece of information, so you don't need to do anything extra with that. H is the height of the package in feet. T is time in seconds. The pilot wants to know how long will it take for it to hit the ground. Anytime you see the word, the phrase, hit the ground, that basically means you're going to set H equal to 0 and solve. Solve using any method. H equals negative 16 t squared plus 1600. Substitute 0 in place of h. On this one, you could do a couple of things. This actually factors best using the GCF because I recognize that that's a 16 and this number starts with a 16. They each, yeah, and so there we go. Okay, sorry, I forgot what was happening. I'm going to factor out, actually I'm dividing every single term by negative 16. That's what I'm doing. 0 divided by negative 16 is 0. That divided by that is t squared. 1600 divided by negative 16 is negative 100. I have two terms here. That's a squared, and 100 I recognize as a perfect square. This one I'm going to solve using the square root method. So this factors as the difference of squares. The square root of t squared is t, and the square root of 100 is 10. So I know that this factors as t plus 10 and t minus 10. I'm going to set each factor equal to 0. So t plus 10 equals 0, and t minus 10 equals 0. I'm going to subtract 10 from both sides. T equals negative 10 seconds. Nope, that's not reasonable. Add the 10 to the other side. T equals 10 seconds. That is a good, reasonable answer. You could also solve this one using the quadratic formula. However, let me say one thing about this. All right, I have negative 16t squared plus 1600. When this starts out, that is your A term and that is your C term. I'm missing the middle B term. I'm missing the one with a plain old t. So if you have a middle term that's missing, you could add what we call a filler 0. So you could rewrite this as negative 16t squared plus 0t plus 1600 if you would like. There's your A term, there's your B term, and there's your C term. And now you could run the quadratic formula on it, and you should get 10 seconds, just like we did when we solved it by square roots. Find the dimensions of a triangle whose base, okay, we have a triangle. Anytime it talks about a shape, first thing I would do is I would draw the shape. So when you draw a triangle, the bottom of it is the base, and it's going to talk about the height in a minute. The height is where you have a perpendicular line that comes down from that corner down to the hypotenuse. So this is where the height is located. It says the base is 4 more than 6 times its height. All right. The base is, you have to remember that is means equal in math. 4 more than means plus 6 times the height. So the base equals 4 plus 6h. It has an area of 208. So it never says anything about the height. So the height is just h, and the base is going to be 4 plus 6h. When it references area, you need to remember the area of a triangle equals 1/2 base height. In place of the A, you're going to sub in 208. The 1/2 stays there. The base, you're going to sub in the 4 plus 6h. And the h is just h. When you multiply, you can rearrange this. I'm going to rewrite this and put the 1/2 and the h together. And then the 4 plus 6h stays in parentheses. I'm going to distribute to get rid of your parentheses. So 208, 1/2 times 4 is 2, h is still there. 1/2 of 6 is 3, and h times h equals h squared. Your equation has to be equal to 0, so I'm going to subtract the 208 to the other side. The right side is all jumbled up. This isn't okay. In standard form, your square term has to come first. The h term comes second, and the constant comes last. So there's my a term, there's my b term, and there's my c term. If I were to try to factor this and I multiply, I'm looking for factors of like 416 that add up to 2. I don't really feel like messing with that, so I'm going to run the quadratic formula. In the quadratic formula, it's usually x equals, but since my variable here is h, that's why I'm starting off with h equals. H equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. A long time ago, I learned the quadratic formula to Pop Goes the Weasel, and that is what I still use. All right, so it says the opposite of b, so I'm going to start with negative 2. Your b squared is 2, so 2 squared minus 4. Your a term is 3. Your c term is negative 208. And your a term is 3. I already did this in my calculator, but you could pause the video, run these numbers in your calculator, and that is 2,500 all over 6. I took the square root of 2,500, and this is a perfect square. So you get negative 2 plus or minus 50 over 6. So the plus or minus we have to split up. That's what's going to give me my two answers. So the one answer is negative 2 plus 50 divided by 6. And the other answer is negative 2 minus 50 divided by 6. You do the math on top first. We get 48 divided by 6. That reduces, and I get 8 equals h, and I don't know if we're talking about inches. 8 inches. Here, when I use the minus sign, I get negative 52 divided by 6, and that equals negative 8.6. Having a negative height is not reasonable. So I'm going to cross that off, and that is a bad answer. It said to find the dimensions. So I know that the height is 8 inches, but I have to find the base. The base is 4 plus 6h. 6 times 8 is 48. 49, 50, and that would be 52 inches for the base. Let me know if you have any questions later.